4:47 a.m., April 3rd, 2026, Norfolk, Virginia. 14 NCIS vehicles moved in formation along Terminal Boulevard, headlights off. Behind them, 6 FBI counterintelligence units staged at the secondary perimeter. The target, a commercial warehouse complex at 2281 Industrial Corridor Drive, leased to a logistics firm called MERIDIAN Supply Partners, LLC. Total value of stolen military hardware believed to be inside, $340 million. The operation had been building for 4 months. It started with a single discrepancy report filed by a civilian contract analyst who almost didn't file it at all. 6 months earlier, nobody at Naval Station Norfolk was thinking about MERIDIAN Supply Partners. Nobody was thinking about the 17 shell layers beneath it, or the Singapore broker network at the other end of the supply chain, or the 2 active-duty Navy officers who had been quietly bleeding the U.S. military for 36 months. What they were thinking about on the morning of October 14th, 2025, was a routine logistics audit that had already been rescheduled twice. Her name was Dana Calloway, civilian GS-11 contract analyst, Naval Logistics Command, attached to Naval Station Norfolk. 12 years on the job. The kind of analyst who reads footnotes. She was working through a backlog of freight reconciliation files, standard audits that cross-check procurement invoices against actual delivery manifests, when she opened file 2025 LQ 04471, a commercial freight invoice. 14 pallets of advanced fiber optic cable components. The components were cataloged under a procurement designation she recognized immediately, NSP7 series. That designation belonged exclusively to the Navy's Undersea Communications Integration Program, a classified fiber optic relay network being installed across key Atlantic submarine corridors. The invoice billed the shipment to a company called Atlantic Defense Subcontractors, Inc. Address, Virginia Beach, Virginia. Calloway pulled the vendor registration database. Atlantic Defense Subcontractors had been registered as a defense contractor in 2019. It had received 2 small contracts in its history, both for administrative supply services. Pens, paper, filing equipment. It had never been awarded a contract under the Undersea Communications Integration Program. It was not on the approved vendor list for NSP7 series components. It was not on any classified procurement chain for that system at all. 14 pallets of Navy fiber optic cable components, billed to a company with no authorization to receive them. She filed a discrepancy report at 10:22 a.m., standard procedure. The report entered the Naval Criminal Investigative Service review queue, and then it sat there for 6 weeks. NCIS Special Agent Raymond Kohler pulled the file on November 29, 2025. He had been assigned to a financial fraud rotation at the Norfolk field office for the previous 8 months, mostly benefits fraud, a few contractor overbilling cases. The Calloway discrepancy report had been flagged as low priority, suspected clerical error, probable vendor coding mistake. Kohler was the kind of agent who didn't close a file until the numbers made sense. The numbers in file 2025 LQ 04471 did not make sense. He ran Atlantic Defense Subcontractors through the standard federal contractor database, registered 2019. 2 contracts. Combined value, $47,000. No employees listed beyond a registered agent. No physical office space on record beyond a mailbox address in Virginia Beach. He ran the NSP7 procurement designation. The fiber optic components in the invoice were not commercially available items. They were custom fabricated specifically for the Navy's Undersea Communications Program, manufactured by a single defense supplier in Maryland under a classified contract. The components had no commercial application. There was no legitimate reason for them to appear on an invoice addressed to Atlantic Defense Subcontractors. Kohler flagged the file and pulled the upstream procurement records for the NSP7 program going back 18 months. What he found took him 3 days to process. The fiber optic invoice was not an anomaly. It was one entry in a pattern. Over the previous 36 months, the Naval Station Norfolk supply chain had processed 214 freight invoices containing components designated under 6 separate classified procurement programs. Radar subsystem components from the AN/SPY-6 Air and Missile Defense Radar Program. Acoustic sensor array modules from the Next Generation Submarine Detection Suite. Encrypted communications hardware from the Naval Integrated Tactical Communications System. In every case, the receiving entity was a small contractor. Different company names, different addresses, different registration dates, but none of them had ever been awarded a contract for the systems in question. Kohler's preliminary estimate of diverted components across 36 months, $218 million. He would later revise that number upward significantly. He brought the file to his supervisor the morning of December 2nd, 2025. By afternoon, the case had been transferred to NCIS headquarters in Quantico. By the following morning, FBI Counterintelligence Division had been briefed. By December 5th, Operation MERIDIAN had a case number. I spent considerable time going through the procurement audit trail in this case, and one detail kept coming back. The network had been running for 3 years, 3 auditing cycles, multiple inspector general reviews, and it stayed invisible. Not because the thieves were particularly clever, but because no single audit was ever cross-referenced against another. The left hand was never shown what the right hand was doing. That's a systemic failure, not a surveillance failure. The joint NCIS FBI task force convened at the Norfolk field office on December 8th, 2025. The immediate priority was containment. The network was still active. Move too fast, and the suspects would scatter. Move too slow, and more hardware would disappear. The first question was structural. How was classified military hardware leaving secure facilities without triggering automated inventory alerts? The answer required them to look at who was approving the outbound shipments. And that pulled a name that changed the scope of the investigation entirely. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Hargrove, Supply Officer, Naval Station Norfolk, 12 years of service, Logistics and Procurement Specialist. Hargrove had system-level access to the Naval Automated Logistics System, the platform that processed and approved outbound freight manifests for all supply chain movements from the base. Task Force analysts pulled Hargrove's approval logs going back 40 months. In that window, Hargrove had personally approved 91 outbound freight manifests containing components now flagged as diverted. 91 approvals. Not one triggered an anomaly flag in the automated system. The reason? Each shipment had been processed under a legitimate maintenance return code, a designation used when defective or surplus components are returned to vendors for repair or replacement. Maintenance returns were a normal part of naval logistics. They moved through the system constantly. And critically, they were subject to reduced secondary inspection requirements because the components were classified as outbound, not inbound. Someone had exploited a procedural gap. Classify the theft as a maintenance return. Move the hardware through the system with legitimate paperwork. No secondary inspection. No cross-reference audit. No alert. But Hargrove couldn't have done this alone. The manifest required 2-point authorization, a supply officer and a logistics coordinator. The task force pulled the second authorization signature. Every one of the 91 flagged manifests had been co-signed by a civilian logistics specialist named Marcus Webb, GS-12, assigned to the Naval Station Norfolk Receiving and Distribution Center. 2 people, working in tandem, over 40 months. Inside a system with institutional blind spots they understood better than the people who designed it. The task force had the mechanism. Now they needed the destination. FBI counterintelligence analysts began building the corporate genealogy of the shell companies that had received the shipments. Atlantic Defense Subcontractors was one node. There were 7 others: Coastal Systems Integration, LLC, Federal Logistics Partners, Inc., Meridian Supply Partners, LLC, Advanced Technical Resources Group, Pacific Maritime Solutions, Continental Defense Services, and Tidewater Procurement Associates. All registered in Virginia, Maryland, or Delaware between 2018 and 2022. All operated by nominee directors with no verifiable military or defense industry backgrounds, all sharing a single point of convergence. Every one of the 8 companies had, at some point in their financial history, wired money to or received money from a holding company registered in Fairfax, Virginia. Apex Defense Consolidators, LLC. Apex Defense Consolidators had been registered in 2018. Its registered agent was a law firm in Tyson's Corner. Its listed director was a man named Thomas Bellard. No military background, no defense industry experience, prior career in commercial import-export. The FBI ran Bellard's financial records. Between 2022 and 2025, Bellard had received $4, $2 million in director compensation from Apex and its subsidiaries. He had also made 13 international wire transfers to accounts in Singapore, the United Arab Emirates, and one routed through a Cayman Islands intermediary to a final destination that analysts were still tracing. Apex Defense Consolidators was the clearinghouse. The stolen hardware moved through the shell network to Apex. Apex repackaged and resold it through Bellard's broker connections. The money flowed back in layers. The strangest part? Apex operated out of a modest office suite in a business park off Route 123 in Fairfax. Shared conference room. Minimal staff. Nothing about the exterior would suggest what was stacking up inside. The FBI counterintelligence team assessed the Singapore and UAE connections in early January 2026. The Singapore broker, identified in court documents as Entity Alpha, had documented prior associations with procurement networks linked to state-adjacent technology acquisition programs. The UAE connection ran through a commercial freight consolidator that had previously appeared in 2 separate federal investigations involving dual-use technology export violations. The word that counterintelligence analysts used in the classified briefing document was proliferation risk. The stolen hardware was not being sold to hobbyists or commercial competitors. It was moving through channels that had previously been used to funnel sensitive technology toward foreign state programs. That reframed everything. Operation MERIDIAN was no longer a theft case. It was a national security investigation. Here's the part that kept analysts busy for weeks. The foreign buyers weren't acquiring the hardware to replicate it. Based on the technical specifications of what was being diverted, the interest appeared to be in specific subcomponents. Particular circuit board architectures and signal processing modules embedded in the acoustic sensor arrays and radar subsystems. Components most useful to someone trying to understand or defeat the detection capabilities of the systems they were pulled from. Not acquisition for replication, acquisition for countermeasure development. That assessment drove the pace of the investigation into a different gear entirely. The task force expanded in early January 2026. The FBI's National Security Division assigned 2 counterintelligence specialists from the Washington field office. NCIS brought in its Technology Crime Directorate. A classified interagency working group was formed with representation from the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Naval Intelligence Command. The operational challenge was real. They needed to map the complete network before moving on any of it. Take down one node too early, and the rest would go dark. The foreign intermediaries would disappear. The money would fragment into accounts that would take years to trace. The hardware already in the pipeline would vanish. They needed patience. Then, on January 17th, 2026, the investigation hit its first serious obstacle. A routine counterintelligence check flagged an anomaly in Marcus Webb's digital communications. His encrypted messaging activity showed a 22-minute gap in his normal pattern, followed by a burst of outgoing traffic to a device registered outside the United States. Webb had been spooked, not by the investigation. The task force had been careful, by something internal. A colleague's offhand comment about a coming audit. A rumor in the supply chain division. The task force had 72 hours before Webb might act. They had not yet mapped the complete network. They had not identified all the shell company operators. They had not confirmed the identity of the foreign end buyers. They decided to approach Webb directly. Not arrest him, but make contact. A controlled approach. An NCIS agent with a cover story. A routine benefits audit. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Webb said nothing incriminating. But the behavioral indicators told the agents what they needed to know. Webb knew something was wrong, and he was calculating his options. The task force adjusted. They accelerated the financial mapping on the remaining shell companies while simultaneously putting Webb under 24-hour surveillance. If he moved money, tried to contact co-conspirators, or prepared to travel, they'd know within minutes. He didn't run, he sat still, which turned out to be the worst thing he could do, because while he was sitting still, the task force kept building. By the end of January 2026, the corporate mapping was complete. The task force had identified 22 individuals with direct involvement in the theft and distribution network, from supply officers at Norfolk to civilian contractors at NSA Crane in Indiana, where a parallel diversion operation had been running through a different logistics specialist using the same maintenance return exploit. NSA Crane, Indiana. The Naval Surface Warfare Center that handles ordnance, electronics, and propulsion system components for the fleet. The Indiana node had been running for 28 months, managed by a civilian logistics manager named Gerald Finch, and co-signed by a supply technician named Darlene Spates. The hardware diverted from Crane had a separate designation string but fed into the same Apex Defense Consolidator's pipeline. The network was larger than the original assessment, much larger. The revised estimate of total hardware value diverted across both locations, $340 million over 36 months. Most people assume these kinds of theft operations get caught quickly because the numbers are too big to hide. The evidence tells a different story. The diversion was invisible for 3 years, precisely because it was spread across dozens of small transactions, processed through legitimate procedural channels, in a system where cross-referencing across sites and programs wasn't standard practice. Dana Calloway's routine audit was the first time anyone had looked at the right 2 documents at the same time. What do you think? Does that represent a failure of the people involved, or a failure of the system that made it possible? Drop your answer in the comments. By early February 2026, the task force had identified 28 individuals across 6 states for arrest. But the investigation hit a second obstacle that threatened to compress the timeline dangerously. An analyst working the financial mapping noticed that Thomas Bellard had applied for a passport renewal in late January 2026. Standard processing, 3 to 4 weeks. But Bellard had paid the expedited fee. His new passport would be ready in February. Bellard had international connections. If he left U.S. jurisdiction before the arrests, he would likely have access to safe harbor through his Singapore or UAE contacts. The foreign intermediaries had resources and legal infrastructure designed precisely for that scenario. The task force pushed its timeline forward. They had originally planned an April arrest window. They kept April but tightened the preparation schedule, compressing 6 weeks of coordination into 3. 28 simultaneous arrests across 6 states. Multiple search warrants. Asset freezes on 11 financial accounts holding an estimated $67 million in proceeds from the hardware sales. Coordination with Interpol on international warrants for 3 foreign intermediaries. 3 months of fieldwork compressed into a tighter window because one man had paid a $150 expedited passport fee. What that detail reveals is worth sitting with. The government assembled a multi-agency task force, ran a 4-month covert investigation, coordinated across dozens of jurisdictions, and nearly had the case collapse because of a passport renewal. The man at the center of a $340 million theft operation nearly walked out of the country on a bureaucratic coincidence. That's not a criticism of the agents involved. They adapted quickly. It's a comment on how thin the margin actually was. The final operational plan for Operation Kel D MERIDIAN was completed on March 18, 2026. 28 arrest teams, 12 search locations, 11 simultaneous financial account freezes coordinated with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. FBI Counterintelligence would handle the Fairfax location, the Apex Defense Consolidator's office, with primary responsibility for evidence recovery. NCIS would lead the Norfolk and Indiana arrests. The critical logistical question: how do you conduct 28 simultaneous arrests across 6 states and ensure that no arrest team moves before the others are in position? One early move. One suspect who checks in with a co-conspirator and gets no response, and the whole network goes to ground. The answer was a 12-minute window. All arrest teams would receive a go command at exactly 4:35 a.m. Eastern on April 3, 2026. 12 minutes was the maximum calculated response time. The interval in which, based on behavioral analysis of the subject's phone and communication patterns, none of them was likely to be in contact with another. 12 minutes, 28 teams, 6 states. What's most striking about this operation isn't the scale of the coordination. Federal law enforcement runs multi-site operations routinely. It's the intelligence depth behind that 12-minute window. The task force had been logging communication patterns on every subject for 8 weeks, mapping who called whom, at what times, with what frequency. The 12 minutes wasn't a guess. It was a calculation based on 56 days of behavioral data. That kind of surveillance granularity is what separates a successful simultaneous takedown from a chaotic one. Here's the take that'll probably get some pushback. The sentence structure prosecutors were building toward: 10 to 15 years for the primary defendants, with the possibility of significant reductions for cooperation, is inadequate for what this case represents. This wasn't benefits fraud or contract overbilling. Military hardware with confirmed connections to foreign state-adjacent intermediaries left U.S. custody and moved through broker networks that exist to service adversarial technology acquisition programs. The people who built this network weren't opportunists who stumbled into theft. They understood what they were diverting and to whom it was likely going. The sentencing framework for military theft doesn't fully account for the national security dimension. That's worth saying plainly. On the evening of April 2nd, 2026, at 11:47 p.m., the 28 arrest teams were in position across Virginia, Maryland, Indiana, North Carolina, Georgia, and Texas. All surveillance feeds were live. All communication intercepts were active. The Fairfax team had visual on the Apex Defense Consolidator's building. Then, at 12:09 a.m., one of the surveillance feeds showed an unexpected vehicle in the parking lot of Marcus Webb's apartment complex in Norfolk, an unregistered sedan. 2 occupants. Neither matched Webb's known associates. The surveillance team ran the plates. The vehicle was registered to a car rental agency at Norfolk International Airport. The rental had been processed 6 hours earlier, paid for with a credit card linked to a name that didn't appear anywhere in the investigation file. The arrest team commander had a decision to make. The unidentified vehicle could be coincidental, a neighbor's visitor, a rideshare pickup for an unrelated resident. Or it could mean that someone in the network had been warned and dispatched people to move Webb before the arrests came. They had 4 hours until the go command. The commander called it as a probable coincidence and held position. The vehicle left the parking lot at 1:33 a.m. Webb remained inside. The surveillance feed confirmed he was in his apartment at 3 a.m., at 4 a.m., at 4:30 a.m. At 4:47 a.m. on April 3, 2026, the go command was transmitted. 14 NCIS vehicles moved along Terminal Boulevard toward the MERIDIAN Supply Partners warehouse. 6 FBI units staged at the secondary perimeter points. At the same moment, arrest teams were moving toward Marcus Webb's apartment in Norfolk, toward Lieutenant Commander Stephen Hargrove's residence in Chesapeake, toward Gerald Finch's home in Crane, Indiana, toward Thomas Bellard's house in McLean, Virginia. The Fairfax team reached the Apex Defense Consolidator's office suite at 4:52 a.m. The building was locked. A facilities manager was contacted by phone and directed to open the building under federal authority. He arrived 7 minutes later, hands unsteady. The FBI evidence team entered the Apex office at 5:04 a.m. What they found inside took 3 days to fully catalog. The office suite. 3 rooms, approximately 1,800 square feet of commercial space, was stacked floor to ceiling with military hardware still in original government packaging, shrink-wrapped pallets, cardboard boxes marked with Defense Department inventory codes, crates sealed with government-issued tamper-evident tape. Components from 6 separate classified procurement programs arranged in neat rows along the walls and filling every available square foot of space. The forensic accounting team documented 847 individual hardware units in the Apex suite, radar subsystem boards, acoustic sensor array modules still in their anti-static transport cases, encrypted communications hardware in sealed government containers, fiber optic relay components from the NSP7 series, the same designation that had appeared in Dana Calloway's discrepancy report 6 months earlier. At the time of the raid, the Apex inventory represented approximately $94 million in military hardware waiting for its next shipment to the broker network. Bellard was arrested at his McLean residence at 5:02 a.m. He said nothing to the arresting agents. He asked for a lawyer before they finished reading the warrant. Hargrove was detained at 4:53 a.m. at his Chesapeake home. Court documents would later indicate that when agents entered his residence, they found a pre-packed travel bag near the front door and a one-way airline ticket to Dubai booked for April 7th, 4 days after the arrest. Webb was taken into custody at 5:01 a.m. He had been awake. The light in his apartment was on when the arrest team reached his door. In Crane, Indiana, Gerald Finch attempted to leave his residence through a rear door as the NCIS arrest team approached the front. He encountered a second team positioned at the rear perimeter. He was detained without incident. The Indiana operation had a complication that hadn't been fully anticipated. The search warrant for the NSA Crane facility required coordination with base security and a separate classified facility access authorization. The paperwork had been processed, but the base security commander at Crane had not been briefed. Standard operational security to prevent any leak reaching Finch. When the NCIS team arrived at the facility gate at 5:15 a.m. Indiana time, the security desk initially refused entry pending verification. It took 22 minutes to reach the appropriate chain of command and authorize access. 22 minutes in which the evidence inside the facility remained uncontrolled. The team later confirmed that nothing had been moved. Finch was already in custody, and no one else with access to the relevant storage areas was on base at that hour. But those 22 minutes were documented in the after-action report as a procedural gap. By 7:30 a.m. Eastern on April 3, 2026, all 28 primary targets had been taken into custody. The 11 financial accounts had been frozen. Asset seizure orders were in place for the Apex inventory and for 7 vehicles and 2 residential properties linked to key defendants. The 28th arrest. A civilian logistics broker in Houston, Texas, who had served as the interface between Apex and one branch of the foreign buyer network, went without incident at 5:47 a.m. Central Time. One detail from the aftermath documentation stuck with me. Among the hardware recovered at the Apex suite, agents found a printed spreadsheet, a physical document, not a digital file, listing 43 component shipments with corresponding payment amounts and buyer codes. The spreadsheet looked like a standard inventory management document, column headers, row numbers, the kind of thing you'd use to track any commercial inventory. Except the column labeled buyer used alphanumeric codes, B7, B12, B19. that the task force's counterintelligence analysts immediately recognized as consistent with the broker identification system used by one of the Singapore-linked procurement networks they had been tracking in a separate classified file. The spreadsheet was a bridge between two investigations. It was the first physical document that directly linked the Norfolk theft operation to a specific foreign procurement network by name. It was also the first piece of evidence confirming the network was larger than Operation Cell MERIDIAN had mapped. The investigation was not over. It had just bifurcated. At federal court in the Eastern District of Virginia, the first indictments were unsealed on the morning of April 3, 2026. 28 defendants. Charges including theft of government property, conspiracy to commit espionage, violating the Arms Export Control Act, money laundering, and making false statements to federal investigators. The two active-duty Navy officers, Hargrove and a second lieutenant commander named Patricia Voss, who had been identified as the Norfolk Node's secondary authorization point, faced the most serious charges. The Arms Export Control Act violations carried potential sentences of up to 20 years per count. The Apex spreadsheet with its 43 buyer codes is still being analyzed. Will investigators close out all 43 lines before any of the foreign intermediaries can establish new supply channels? Comment YES or no, because based on the timeline of every previous case in this category, the answer matters. Thomas Bellard entered a guilty plea on May 19, 2026, to reduce charges in exchange for cooperation with the counterintelligence investigation. His cooperation has been described in court filings as substantial and ongoing. The terms of his plea agreement remain partially sealed, pending the completion of the foreign network investigation. Marcus Webb entered a guilty plea on June 3, 2026. Charges: conspiracy to commit theft of government property and making false statements. Prosecutors did not file the espionage-adjacent charges against Webb, which legal analysts assessed as a reflection of his role. He was a facilitator with documented access to the logistics mechanism, but limited visibility into the foreign buyer end of the network. Lieutenant Commander Hargrove's trial is scheduled to begin in September 2026. He has pleaded not guilty. Lieutenant Commander Voss pleaded guilty on June 17, 2026. The sentencing hearing has not yet been scheduled. Gerald Finch, the Crane, Indiana node manager, is cooperating with investigators. His cooperation has provided additional details about the hardware originating from the Indiana operation and its movement through the Apex pipeline. Information that has reportedly been material to the ongoing counterintelligence investigation. Of the 28 individuals arrested, 22 have either pleaded guilty or entered cooperation agreements. 6 remain in pretrial status. The hardware recovered at the Apex suite, the $94 million in components seized on April 3rd, has been cataloged and is being assessed by the Navy for potential reintegration or secure destruction, depending on whether any of the components were compromised by handling outside controlled custody. The assessment is classified. Of the estimated $340 million in hardware diverted over 36 months, approximately $94 million was recovered at Apex. The remaining $246 million in components is unaccounted for. Prosecutors believe the majority of that hardware has already moved through the foreign broker network to end destinations. Some of it may be in foreign custody. Some may have been disassembled. Some may have already been used for the purpose for which it was acquired. 3 individuals linked to the foreign buyer side of the network, including the broker identified as Entity Alpha in the Singapore connection, remain under international warrant. They have not been located. Interpol notices are active. The Cayman Islands financial routing used by one branch of the Apex proceeds distribution has not been fully traced. Prosecutors estimate between $12 million and $19 million in proceeds moved through that channel to accounts that remain unidentified. The FBI's Financial Intelligence Unit continues to work that thread. Dana Calloway, the contract analyst at Naval Logistics Command, whose discrepancy report initiated the investigation, returned to her standard duties after being interviewed by the task force in December 2025. She was not called as a witness in any of the plea proceedings. Her name does not appear in any of the public court documents. She filed a routine audit. It sat in a queue for 6 weeks. Then it wasn't routine anymore. If you've been working through a system long enough to understand its blind spots, the procedural gaps, the cross-referencing failures, the audit cycles that never quite overlap, you understand something that takes most people years to see. The Naval Automated Logistics System flagged 0 anomalies over 36 months and 214 fraudulent transactions. Not because it wasn't designed to flag anomalies, because no one had told it to look at the intersection where the anomalies lived. The network is dismantled. The hardware that made it out is gone. 3 warrants are still open. The buyers are still operational. If this case tells you anything about the defense supply chain, subscribe, because there are more like this. And the ones that haven't been caught yet started exactly the same way. The demand for what Apex was selling didn't disappear on April 3rd, 2026. It existed before the network was built. It existed while the network ran for 3 years undetected. It exists now. The next version of this won't look the same. It rarely does.